Hi guys, tonight we begin a calm journey into one of the most difficult and hidden roles of the Second World War, the life of a U-boat commander. These men lived beneath the surface of the ocean in silence and darkness, carrying the weight of entire crews on their shoulders. They faced fear, hunger, constant danger, and the crushing isolation of the deep sea. In this story, we will slowly walk through their daily existence and understand why life as a U-boat commander was almost impossible. Before we get started, if you enjoy exploring hidden corners of history at a slower pace, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where in the world you're tuning in from. I'd love to connect with you there. Beneath the waves, the commander of a U-boat carried responsibilities that stretched far beyond issuing orders. Every decision was a balance between survival and destruction. The confined steel tube that was his vessel became a moving prison, where each mistake could end the lives of dozens of men within seconds. The commander's eyes were always on the horizon, even when no horizon could be seen, and his ears strained to pick up the faintest sound of enemy propellers through the hydrophones. It was not only about guiding a machine, it was about guiding human souls through the most unnatural of environments. The first challenge of a commander was the environment itself. Life underwater was damp, heavy with diesel fumes, and filled with the constant vibration of machinery. The air grew stale quickly, and after days submerged, it became difficult to breathe without feeling sick. Mold grew on clothing and food alike, and condensation dripped from every surface, creating a constant dampness that clung to skin and spirit. The commander, unlike others, had no escape from responsibility. He had to look at these conditions not only as discomfort, but as a factor that shaped the performance and morale of his men. A sick or despairing sailor could make the difference between evasion and destruction. Food was another burden that fell under his watch. At the beginning of a mission, the U-boat would be stocked so full that even the smallest corners were crammed with bread, sausages, and canned goods. As the days passed, the smell turned sour, fresh supplies rotted, and what was left often tasted of mold and diesel. Commanders themselves ate no better than their crews, but they bore the added weight of knowing that poor nutrition would weaken the men they depended upon. Beyond the physical, the commander lived in constant psychological strain. Silence was his weapon and his curse. Every decision to surface or dive had to be weighed against unseen threats above. He knew that destroyers prowled, armed with sonar and depth charges ready to hunt him down. To surface in daylight risked detection from aircraft, but to stay submerged meant dwindling oxygen and exhausted batteries. The commander balanced on this razor's edge, always uncertain which choice might bring death closer. The loneliness of command was deeper than the sea itself. He could never show fear, never let his voice tremble. Even when panic surged within him, he had to project calm because the men's trust was his most vital tool. Many commanders learned to live with a mask, hiding their doubts behind steady eyes, though inside they carried the weight of 1,000 silent questions. Will we make it home? Will this next order end everything? Every mission carried with it not only the enemy's danger but also the enemy within, the mind's exhaustion. Sleep was broken and shallow, often interrupted by alarms, mechanical failures, or the need to make sudden decisions. A commander lived in fragments of rest, his dreams filled with echoes of sonar pings and the rush of explosions. He never truly escaped the war, not even in his brief moments of sleep. And so, in this first step of our journey, we begin to see why life as a U-boat commander was almost impossible. It was not simply the enemy above, or the crushing depths below, but the constant weight of responsibility, the endless fight against both environment and mind that made every mission a test of human endurance. The U-boat commander's day began long before the crew stirred from their bunks. In truth, there was no sunrise to mark time, only the soft glow of dim red lamps and the faint ticking of a clock mounted near the periscope. Time in a submarine was an abstraction, broken into watches and duties, yet for the commander it was a constant flow of awareness. He woke not because he wanted to, but because he never truly slept. Every creak of the hull, every subtle change in engine rhythm, Every shift in the air pressure kept him tethered to wakefulness. This constant vigilance was one of the unseen burdens that eroded the mind slowly and without mercy. The commander often started his day with reports from the watch officer. Battery levels, oxygen saturation, and the boat's depth were all logged carefully. Small numbers meant survival or death, and it was his role to make sense of them instantly. The hydrophone operator's report followed, a quiet voice speaking of distant propeller noises, of faint hums in the water that might mean enemy convoys or lurking destroyers. To others, it might have sounded like static. To the commander, it was a language of survival. Each sound painted an invisible map of threats and opportunities. Moving through the cramped passageways, he would check on his men. Every face told a story: fatigue, anxiety, forced calm. A commander could not ignore the human element. The chief engineer might be sweating over the engines, already worn by constant strain. The cook, working in impossible conditions, tried to stretch dwindling supplies into meals that could sustain morale as much as the body. The torpedo crew cleaned their weapons with ritual precision, knowing that one jammed mechanism could mean doom. The commander's quiet presence reassured them, even if he said nothing. Leadership on a submarine was not loud or dramatic. It was quiet, steady, and unyielding. By midday, the routine became a cycle of decision-making. Should they surface briefly to recharge batteries, risking detection by aircraft? Should they dive deeper, conserving stealth but draining precious power? Every option carried danger, and the commander's instinct, sharpened by training and haunted by past missions, guided him. His mind worked constantly, running calculations no one else could see, weighing probabilities that could never be confirmed. The pressure of being solely responsible for life and death was immense. As hours turned into days, the environment tightened its grip. The air grew stale, the metallic tang of carbon dioxide thickened in the lungs. Water droplets formed on every surface, dripping endlessly, soaking into bedding and clothes. The commander's uniform never truly dried, and the dampness seeped into his bones. Yet he could not show discomfort. His calmness was the crew's anchor. Beneath the surface calm, however, the commander's heart carried a constant weight. He knew that destroyers were always near, listening, hunting. He knew that each decision might bring silence, or sudden explosions that shattered steel and bone alike. And still, he guided his boat forward, deeper into danger, knowing that his role was not simply to survive but to strike when the time was right. For the men of the U-boat, routine defined existence. For the commander, it was a chess game against an unseen opponent, played in the dark, with lives as the pieces. The silence of the deep was both a shield and a torment. For the commander, every hour submerged carried layers of tension that the rest of the world could never fully grasp. The submarine seemed to breathe with him, its hull creaking softly under pressure, its machinery humming with ceaseless rhythm. In those moments, he often felt the weight of the ocean pressing against the thin steel walls, reminding him that nature itself was as much an enemy as the Allied ships above. To manage this constant strain, he relied on routine checks. The periscope was his narrow window to the outside world, lifted cautiously to scan the endless horizon. A sliver of daylight through the eyepiece felt unreal, almost dreamlike after days of red-lit confinement. Yet this glimpse came at great risk. One mistake, one flash of light reflecting off the lens, could betray their position to vigilant patrols waiting to strike. Each time the periscope was raised, the commander held his breath, knowing how thin the line was between survival and destruction. In these brief moments of connection to the surface, he studied the sky, the sea, the movement of waves. His mind read signs invisible to others, the faint wake of a ship, the distant glimmer of aircraft wings, the sudden ripple that hinted at danger. The crew depended on his interpretation, trusting him to see what they could not. But what weighed heavily was the realization that he too was only human, prone to doubt and error. Inside the boat, life pulsed in close quarters. The commander's presence was a quiet constant, moving among his men, offering words of encouragement or simply a steady look that carried reassurance. He knew each by name, by habit, by the way they coped with stress. Some cracked jokes in the mess, their laughter forced but vital. Others withdrew into silence, eyes distant, thoughts drifting to families left behind. The commander bore these silent stories, aware that each life was tied to the success of his choices. What made the role almost unbearable was the solitude of leadership. Even when surrounded by dozens of men, the commander's burden was his alone. No one else could decide when to surface, when to fire, when to flee. Every order shaped destiny. When depth charges rumbled in the distance, he could not reveal the fear that clawed inside him. To falter meant to spread panic, and panic was death. So he remained composed, his calm voice steady against the backdrop of mechanical groans and whispered prayers. In those long hours, the commander wrestled not only with enemy forces but with his own mind. Doubt whispered constantly. Had he chosen the right course? Was silence safety, or a trap? Could he lead these men back to the light of day? The answers never came easily, and often not at all. Still, he pressed on, bound by duty, knowing that his crew's trust was the last fragile thread holding them together in the darkness. Night and day blurred into one inside the submarine, but the commander had to preserve a rhythm for his men. He knew that routine kept despair at bay, so he structured the watches with careful balance, rotating duties to spread the burden. In truth, he himself lived without such mercy. He drifted in and out of half-sleep, his mind tethered to the boat's heartbeat. Even with his eyes closed, he sensed the hum of the motors, the vibration of the propeller, the subtle changes in depth. It was as if his body had merged with the machine, sharing its restless pulse. One of the most trying duties was listening. Hydrophone operators worked in silence, reporting faint contacts. Bearing 210, slow screws, distance uncertain. The commander leaned in, translating whispers of the sea into decisions. Was it a merchant ship, easy prey, or a destroyer eager for the kill? He could never be sure. The ocean distorted sound, and illusions often danced across the headphones. Yet he had to act, guiding his boat into position or away from unseen danger. The crew never heard the long debates inside his head. They only saw the results, a sudden dive, a quiet order to alter course, or the tense preparation for attack. Food grew worse as patrols stretched on. Bread turned green with mould, potatoes sprouted in the damp air, and meat spoiled despite careful storage. The commander encouraged his men to eat what remained, even when it sickened the stomach. He understood that hunger made tempers flare, and tempers endangered discipline. He too chewed the same foul rations, hiding his disgust. Leadership was often expressed not in speeches but in small acts. Sharing a bad meal, enduring the same misery. The air was another invisible enemy. After days underwater, oxygen thinned, and every breath became heavier. The commander checked gauges with quiet dread, calculating how much longer they could remain submerged. Men grew lightheaded, some fainted, and headaches became constant companions. Opening the hatches to ventilate was always a gamble. Fresh air invited detection. He had to decide whether survival today meant certain danger tomorrow. Beneath these burdens, he carried memories of training, of fellow officers who had not returned. He remembered their faces, their laughter, their confident plans that ended in silence at the bottom of the sea. Each mission reminded him that his turn could come at any moment. The pressure of command was not only about leading men through present dangers, but also about living with the ghosts of those who had already failed. Yet he never allowed his voice to betray this. To the crew, his orders were firm, his tone steady, his gaze unshaken. In truth, that composure was the thin barrier between fragile order and chaos. For in the dark, with the sea pressing in, fear could spread like fire. His calmness was the shield that kept the crew together, even when the world outside threatened to tear them apart. The commander's cabin was little more than a narrow bunk with a small desk wedged between compartments. Privacy was almost non-existent, yet it was here he pored over maps, charts, and coded orders. Dim light flickered across his notes as he calculated courses, fuel consumption, and potential attack routes. Every line on paper carried consequences measured not only in miles but in lives. Messages from headquarters, delivered by radio, were sometimes vague or outdated, but they weighed heavily. Should he obey the directive to patrol a distant shipping lane, even if supplies were running low? Should he pursue a convoy whose escort strength was uncertain? Headquarters gave the orders, but it was he who bore the weight of making them real. The silence of leadership stretched further than the silence of the ocean. He could not confide in his officers when doubts gnawed at him. To admit uncertainty would erode their confidence, and so he locked those fears inside. His pen moved steadily across the chart even when his mind hesitated, masking hesitation with the calm of procedure. This isolation, though invisible, was one of the greatest hardships of command. Communication was scarce and dangerous. To transmit a message risked detection, and every second the antenna reached into the air above, it invited enemy direction finding. The commander had to decide carefully. Was it worth the risk to update headquarters, or should they remain ghosts, silent and unseen? Often he chose silence, knowing that secrecy was survival. Yet with silence came loneliness. Weeks could pass without hearing a human voice beyond his own crew. The ocean became a vast emptiness where he guided his men like a captain lost in an endless night. During tense moments he leaned on discipline. Orders were given with quiet certainty, and his crew followed without question. Trust in his command was absolute, but he never forgot how fragile that trust was. One wrong choice, one unnecessary risk, could unravel it forever. And so he measured his words as carefully as his maps, always mindful that every phrase carried the weight of authority. When alarms sounded, when the boat shuddered under the shock of nearby explosions, it was his calm commands that steadied hearts. To an outsider, his voice might have seemed cold. To his crew, it was the anchor that kept them from despair. For the commander, the burden never lessened. Each dive, each surface, each plotted course was a test. The sea gave no forgiveness, and the enemy gave no second chances. This was why his life was nearly impossible, not because of a single great challenge, but because of the endless chain of small, crushing decisions that never ceased, even for a moment. Every commander understood that silence was survival, but silence could also drive a man close to madness. Days submerged with no sound except the groan of steel and the throb of engines created an atmosphere heavy enough to smother thought. For the crew, this silence was oppressive, but for the commander it was a reminder of his greatest fear, that somewhere above, destroyers waited with patient cruelty. He often stood near the hydrophone operator, listening not with his ears alone but with his entire being. The faint pulse of distant screws, the vague echo of machinery through layers of seawater, these were clues to a hidden world. The operator's murmured bearings became the threads of an invisible tapestry, and the commander wove them together in his mind, imagining convoys, escorts, and hunters moving unseen in the dark expanse above. Each decision that followed balanced on the knife's edge of interpretation. If he judged wrongly, the submarine could surface under the shadow of a destroyer or dive directly into an ambush. The responsibility was endless, and the silence gave no answers. Inside the boat, tension gathered like a storm. Men argued over small things, space to sleep, rations, personal habits, but the commander had to ease these tempers quietly. He could not allow anger to spread unchecked. A harsh word here, a calm reassurance there, a reminder of discipline. All were tools he used to keep the fragile harmony intact. The cook sometimes offered stale bread with a touch of humour, and the commander would join in the laugh, though inside he felt none of it. Laughter was medicine, and he prescribed it even when his own soul was heavy. When depth charges rumbled in the distance, silence changed from torment into salvation. Engines slowed, men held their breath, and every sound was measured against the enemy's ears. The commander ordered calm as if his words could steady the very hull itself. He imagined destroyers circling, sonar beams slicing through the ocean, explosives waiting to tear the submarine apart. In those moments, silence became unbearable, yet breaking it meant certain death. The commander's mind wrestled with time itself. Should he surface under cover of night, gambling on darkness to hide their wake? Or should he remain submerged until lungs ached for air and batteries gave out? Each path carried danger. Each second ticked like a countdown, and through it all he could never show fear. To his men, his eyes were steady, his tone unbroken. But deep within, silence roared louder than any explosion, a weight pressing against his chest, a constant reminder that in the war beneath the sea, survival belonged only to those who could endure the unbearable. The commander's relationship with the ocean was unlike that of any sailor on the surface. For him, the sea was not simply water and waves. It was a living, shifting adversary. Pressure grew with every metre of depth, squeezing the hull until it groaned like an ancient beast. He listened to those sounds with quiet dread, aware that even the smallest crack could mean the end. The men trusted the steel shell to hold, but he knew how fragile it truly was. At great depths, the line between safety and destruction was measured in millimetres. Beyond the physical dangers, the ocean played tricks on the mind. Darkness was absolute, and the lack of daylight bent the sense of time until hours and days lost their meaning. The commander alone had to maintain order against this timeless void. He rotated the watches, kept the logbook precise, and spoke of morning and evening even when the sun was a memory. Without such structure, despair would have seeped into every corner of the boat. Yet even with structure, the sea whispered doubts. A sudden shudder might be mistaken for a depth charge. A strange current could pull the boat off course. The compass spun, gauges flickered, and he knew that his crew depended on him to read the truth from chaos. Each correction, each calculation, was made with calm precision, though inside he fought the gnawing thought that a single mistake could doom them all. Resurfacing after days underwater brought its own terrors. Breaking the surface meant risking detection by radar or aircraft, but it also meant salvation, fresh air, a glimpse of the sky, batteries recharged. The commander would climb to the conning tower, the wind sharp against his face, and for a brief moment he felt like a man again, no longer entombed in steel. Yet his eyes never rested. He scanned the horizon, searching for the shadow of a ship or the glint of wings. Even the beauty of moonlight on the water was a warning, for it could betray their presence to enemies watching from above. These moments of contact with the outside world reminded him of what he fought for: the possibility of return, the memory of open air, the promise of life beyond war. But they also reinforced the impossibility of his task. He was caught between two worlds, the crushing depths below and the watchful hunters above, with no place truly safe. The ocean, vast and eternal, cared nothing for his mission. It pressed against the submarine with indifference, demanding strength that few men could endure. And still, he guided his crew forward, knowing that his duty was not only to face the enemy but to survive the sea itself. Inside the U-boat, space was the commander's constant enemy. Every corridor was narrow, every corner crowded with pipes, valves, and machinery. Men brushed shoulders, simply moving from one end to the other, and privacy vanished completely. The commander shared these conditions, yet his burden was greater. He had to make order out of chaos in a world where there was no room to breathe. He memorized the placement of every lever and switch, knowing that in an emergency there would be no time to think, only to act. Even the smallest malfunction could spiral into catastrophe if not handled instantly. The claustrophobic design of the submarine shaped the very rhythm of life. Bunks were shared, with sailors sleeping in shifts, still warm from the body that had just left. Clothing hung damp along bulkheads, boots piled in corners, and the air reeked of sweat, oil, and unwashed bodies. For the crew, this was daily misery. For the commander, it was a constant reminder of how fragile discipline could be in such conditions. A careless word, an argument, or a breakdown of patience could spread quickly in the confined space, so he watched carefully, stepping in before tension grew too sharp. Machinery filled every inch of the boat, and its demands were endless. The commander inspected gauges, listened for changes in pitch, and questioned engineers about the state of the engines. He knew that his boat was a living system, one that demanded vigilance every moment. If the air compressors failed, oxygen would thin. If the pumps faltered, water would rise in the bilges. If the batteries overheated, fire could spread faster than it could be contained. Each possibility haunted him, and he carried the knowledge that his men looked to him for calm when alarms rang out. The lack of space also meant the absence of escape. On land, a commander might walk alone to clear his mind. At sea, he could retreat to a cabin. But here, there was no retreat. Even his small bunk was surrounded by the sounds of men breathing, coughing, and whispering in restless sleep. Every thought, every fear remained with him, pressed close by the steel walls. The claustrophobia was not only physical but mental, a weight pressing deeper with every passing day. Yet the commander learned to endure. He spoke sparingly but with purpose, conserving his words for when they mattered most. He moved with deliberate calm, showing his men that order still existed even in the tightest confines. By holding himself steady, he gave them something to mirror. For in the narrow spaces of the U-boat, one man's fear could infect the entire crew, but one man's composure could hold them all together. The greatest test for any U-boat commander came when an enemy convoy was sighted. In those tense moments, all the hours of waiting, all the silence and restraint, turned into a single chance to strike. Through the narrow lens of the periscope, the commander studied the distant shapes. Merchant vessels heavy with supplies, guarded by sleek destroyers prowling the edges. He measured speed, distance, and direction with calm precision, his mind working like a machine. Every calculation had to be exact, for a torpedo wasted was not only lost ammunition, but a missed chance for survival. The crew prepared in silence, trusting his commands. Torpedoes were loaded, gauges checked, and engines adjusted. Yet the burden of choice was his alone. Should he fire now, risking detection by escorts? Should he wait for a better angle, gambling that the convoy would not alter course? Each decision balanced destruction and safety, and the smallest hesitation could cost them everything. When the moment came, the commander gave the order quietly, almost softly. The hiss of compressed air launched the torpedoes into the deep, each one carrying hope and danger alike. Seconds stretched into eternity as he held the periscope steady, watching for the distant bloom of fire or the dreaded miss. Success brought cheers from the men, but for him, victory carried a shadow. An attack meant retaliation, and he knew the destroyers would descend with fury. The thrill of striking the enemy lasted only a heartbeat before the true test began. Depth charges soon followed, pounding the ocean with thunder. The commander ordered evasive maneuvers, guiding the submarine deeper, zigzagging through black water. The boat shuddered with every nearby explosion. Lights flickered, and dust fell from the bulkheads. Men clenched their jaws, gripping pipes and rails, waiting for the next shock. Through it all, the commander's voice remained steady, giving orders with calm clarity. Inside, however, his thoughts raced. Was the boat diving too steeply? Were the batteries draining too quickly? Could the hull withstand the strain of another barrage? Yet none of this reached his lips. To his crew, he was unshaken, the calm eye in a storm of chaos. Hours of pursuit might follow, the destroyers circling, listening, hunting. Silence once again became their shield, as the engines slowed and men whispered, afraid even of their own breath. The commander listened for patterns in the explosions, waiting for the moment when the hunters lost the trail. Only then could he guide the submarine back to safer waters. For the crew, survival felt like a miracle. For the commander, it was another reminder of the razor's edge on which they lived, where each success brought with it new peril, and each day asked more than any man could truly give. When the depth charges finally ceased and the ocean returned to stillness, relief swept through the crew, but for the commander there was no true peace. He knew the silence above was deceptive. Destroyers might linger for hours, even days, waiting for the U-boat to surface. His decisions in those moments demanded endless patience. To rise too early was to invite death, yet to remain submerged risked suffocating his men and draining the batteries. He sat quietly near the control room, eyes on the gauges, calculating time with grim precision. Each tick of the clock felt louder than the detonations that had shaken them minutes before. The men leaned on his composure, believing his silence meant certainty, though in truth it was a mask. He bore the responsibility of choosing when to breathe again, knowing either choice carried danger. During these long waits, the submarine became a coffin of nerves. The air thickened with carbon dioxide, making every breath heavier. Tempers flared, though men tried to swallow their frustration. A cough seemed too loud, a dropped tool like a hammer on steel. The commander enforced quiet with a raised hand, reminding them that their lives depended on stillness. His own lungs burned with the same stale air, yet he could not show discomfort. He paced slowly, checked instruments, whispered instructions, and showed no sign of weakness. Hours blended together, and fatigue pulled at his mind. He thought of the surface, fresh wind, starlight, the simple relief of open space, but he forced the longing away. Survival demanded sacrifice, and his men would endure only as long as he did. Finally, when the hydrophone reported nothing but distant emptiness, he made the call. Orders were given with calm certainty. Surface under cover of night. Engines hummed softly as the submarine rose, the hull creaking as pressure released. At last the hatch opened, and fresh air poured inside. For the crew, it was life itself. They gasped, laughed quietly, and filled their lungs as if reborn. The commander, standing in the conning tower, let the night wind touch his face. Stars glittered above, beautiful and cold, reminding him of the world beyond war. Yet even in that moment of relief, his eyes never stopped searching the horizon. For him, the struggle never ended. Each breath of freedom carried the shadow of danger, and each star above reminded him how small and fragile they truly were beneath the endless sky. The rhythm of U-boat life was one of extremes, periods of tense action followed by stretches of endless waiting. For the commander, the waiting was often harder to endure. In action, decisions came quickly, adrenaline sharpened thought, and instinct carried him forward. But in the still hours between, the weight of leadership pressed down hardest. He sat in his cramped cabin, maps spread across the desk, running through calculations he had already checked a dozen times. The silence of routine magnified every doubt. Was the course correct? Would supplies last? Were enemy patrols already aware of their presence? Such questions never left him, gnawing quietly at the edges of his mind. The crew, in these lulls, filled time with small rituals. Letters from home, read and reread until the paper frayed, were tucked carefully into lockers. Some carved small figures from scrap wood, others played cards, and a few simply closed their eyes, retreating into private worlds. The commander allowed these distractions, even encouraged them, knowing how vital they were for morale. Yet he himself had no such escape. His duties left little space for personal reflection, and even in rare quiet moments he remained alert, his thoughts tethered to the sea outside. Supplies dwindled with each passing day. He watched food stocks shrink, noting which items spoiled first, planning meals with the cook to make rations last. The air thickened more quickly on long patrols, and he checked the chemical filters constantly. Every system was a thread holding them alive, and it was his task to ensure none of those threads snapped. Fatigue was another hidden enemy. The crew slept in rotating shifts, but the commander never enjoyed true rest. His sleep came in fragments, half an hour here, a few minutes there, interrupted by alarms or sudden reports. He often woke with the taste of metal in his mouth, the stale dampness of the submarine clinging to him, and yet he rose without complaint because he knew the men watched him. To see their commander falter would be to lose faith, and faith was as important as fuel. He cultivated calm, showing steady composure even when his body begged for rest. In the quiet, memories of home sometimes surfaced. A familiar street, a voice from childhood, the sound of laughter now unreachable. For the commander, such thoughts were double-edged. They reminded him of why he fought, but also of how far he had drifted from ordinary life. He locked them away quickly, burying them beneath duty. For in the waiting, just as in the battles, he was never free from the responsibility of leading others through the impossible. And so, the hours passed, each one a test not of strength or speed, but of endurance, patience, and unshakable resolve. One of the heaviest burdens a U-boat commander carried was the knowledge that his men were far from home, trapped in an unnatural world where the line between life and death was razor thin. He could not change their fate, but he could influence how they endured it. Discipline was essential, but so was humanity. He moved quietly among his sailors, noting the pale face of one man who had eaten little for days, or the nervous twitch in another whose sleep was broken by nightmares. These details, invisible to most, were clear to him, and he addressed them with subtlety, a word of encouragement, a change in duty, sometimes even silence that gave space for resilience to return. He understood that a commander's role was not only tactical, but deeply personal. Beneath the surface, illness was a constant threat. With no doctors on board, even small infections or fevers could spiral into danger. The commander had to decide when a man could continue working and when to ease his duties, balancing compassion against the need for manpower. He himself endured discomforts without complaint, setting the example that strength was not the absence of pain, but the ability to carry it without faltering. Leadership was not about appearing invincible, but about showing steadiness that inspired others to keep moving forward. The monotony of patrols weighed heavily. Weeks passed with no sight of the sky, no sound of the natural world beyond the hum of engines. Men lost track of days, and fatigue seeped into their bones. The commander fought this erosion of spirit by maintaining routine. Inspections at the same hour, reports delivered in order, small ceremonies that gave the illusion of structure. In a place where time dissolved, structure became survival. He too clung to it, writing logs with precision even when the words blurred from exhaustion. Each entry was more than record-keeping. It was proof that order still existed amid chaos. From time to time, he allowed moments of relief. When conditions permitted, the submarine surfaced and men climbed briefly into the conning tower to breathe fresh air. The commander stood among them, letting the wind touch his face. He never allowed himself to appear indulgent, but inside these rare breaths of freedom rekindled his strength. For a few short minutes the sea became something other than a prison, and the stars above reminded them all of life beyond steel and war. Yet even in those quiet moments, his vigilance did not rest. His eyes scanned the horizon, his ears tuned for engines, his mind calculating escape routes. Relaxation was for his men. For him, it was another layer of duty, to be enjoyed only in silence, never in truth. He bore it without complaint, because he knew the impossible truth. Their survival depended not only on the strength of steel and torpedoes, but on the strength of one man's resolve to keep fear at bay. Every commander knew that storms on the surface were as dangerous as enemy warships. When forced to sail through heavy seas, the U-boat pitched and rolled violently, water crashing over the conning tower, waves pounding against the hull with relentless force. For the men inside, the noise was deafening, a constant roar as if the ocean itself wanted to tear the submarine apart. The commander braced himself in the control room, issuing calm instructions while every muscle in his body tensed against the violent motion. He knew that surfacing in such conditions was risky, yet sometimes necessary to clear stale air or recharge the drained batteries. The choice to rise into chaos or remain submerged in suffocating silence was his alone. Storms tested more than the boat. They tested the human spirit. Men grew seasick, their strength sapped by endless heaving. Equipment rattled loose, leaks formed, and exhaustion spread quickly. The commander walked through the cramped compartments, steadying himself against pipes and rails, speaking in a voice that cut through fear. He reminded his crew that storms passed, that steel was strong, and that endurance was their greatest weapon. He never admitted how much he too longed for calm seas, for he understood that his courage was borrowed by others in their weakest moments. At night, when lightning split the sky, he often climbed into the conning tower, secured by ropes, and stared across the raging black water. The flashes illuminated towering waves, each one like a mountain rising to swallow them. In those seconds, he felt both the fury and majesty of nature. Unlike destroyers or aircraft, the storm had no intent, no strategy. It was pure force, indifferent to war, and its indifference humbled him more than any enemy. Yet even then, he calculated, could they use the storm to mask their presence, hiding beneath its chaos? Could convoys be approached while escorts struggled in the same seas? He turned every hardship into strategy, because a commander had no luxury of despair. When the storm at last relented, the submarine bore scars, equipment damaged, men drained, supplies spoiled by seawater. The commander oversaw repairs with quiet determination, knowing that momentum must be restored quickly. Storms did not end the war above or the hunt below. They were simply another trial in a life defined by trials. For his men, the storm was a misery they endured together. For him, it was another impossible choice survived, another reminder that leadership was not about strength alone, but about guiding others through the fury of both nature and man. Communication with the outside world was one of the rarest and most dangerous tasks a U-boat commander faced. Radio messages were both lifelines and traps. Orders from headquarters arrived encoded, demanding updates on positions or assigning new patrol areas. To respond meant raising the antenna, sending signals into the open air where Allied direction finding could quickly lock onto their location. The commander weighed every word carefully, often choosing silence over risk. He knew that obedience to command had to be balanced with the survival of his crew, and in those moments he carried the burden of interpreting not only the code but the intent behind it. The men never heard the debates in his mind. They saw only his calm decision, whether to risk transmission or remain ghosts beneath the sea. When messages were received, they were often vague, stripped of detail by the need for secrecy. The commander read them in the glow of a red lamp, pencil scratching across charts as he plotted new courses. He alone bore the responsibility of deciding how to carry out these orders, turning abstract directives into life-or-death maneuvers across thousands of miles of hostile ocean. His crew trusted that he knew more than he revealed, but in truth, he often guided them through shadows, relying on instinct as much as information. The radio officer worked with steady hands, tapping keys that carried coded signals across the ether. Each transmission was brief, a whisper against the vast silence of the sea. When the commander gave permission, he stood close by, counting seconds in his head, everyone a risk. He imagined enemy antennas straining to catch their signal, triangulating their position, guiding hunters toward them. When the message was complete, he ordered the antenna down, the set powered off, and silence restored. Afterward, he often lingered in thought, staring at the map as though it might answer the questions that plagued him. Was the risk worth it? Had the enemy heard? Would the next order bring them closer to success or disaster? Yet he could never show hesitation. To his men, the receipt of a message meant purpose, direction, a sense that their lonely voyage had meaning. He gave them that assurance with a steady voice, hiding the uncertainty that gnawed at him. In the end, the commander understood that his war was not only fought against enemy ships, but against time, chance, and fate itself. Radio signals were reminders of this truth, that in the vastness of the ocean, even the faintest whisper could decide whether they lived to see another dawn. The commander's greatest burden was often invisible to the men around him, the weight of memory. Each patrol was not only a battle against the enemy, but also a continuation of all those that had come before. He remembered fellow officers who had not returned, boats that vanished without a trace, crews swallowed by the sea. Official reports spoke of losses, but he knew the faces, the laughter, the small human details behind each missing vessel. Those memories travelled with him into every mission, whispering reminders that his turn might come at any moment. He carried them in silence, never sharing the full depth of his thoughts, because to do so would shatter the fragile confidence his men placed in him. At sea, rituals helped shield the crew from despair. Birthdays were marked with a shared song, holidays with improvised decorations hung among pipes and wires. The commander often joined these moments quietly, allowing himself a rare smile. He knew how much they mattered, even if only for a few minutes. Laughter and song turned the submarine from a prison into a fragment of home. Yet when the celebrations ended, it was he who reminded them to return to silence, to discipline, to survival. The contrast was sharp, and he bore the responsibility of balancing humanity with necessity. His own inner rituals were more private. At the end of each long day, he opened his logbook and wrote with care, recording not just the facts of depth, course, and weather, but the truth of their endurance. Each page was a testament, not only for headquarters, but for himself. The act of writing gave order to chaos, a sense that even in the most unpredictable seas, there remained a record of their struggle. Sometimes he paused, pen in hand, thinking of who might one day read his words if he did not return. In such moments, he felt the closeness of mortality more than ever. Dreams, when they came, were restless. He often woke in the small hours, heart racing from visions of explosions or drowning, only to realize the boat still moved steadily through the black water. The crew slept around him, trusting that he was awake, alert, and in control. He rose quietly, made his rounds, and let his calm presence reassure them even in their sleep. It was a form of unspoken leadership, one that did not require orders or speeches. In truth, his men never knew the full cost of this vigilance, nor did he expect them to. He had chosen this path, accepted its loneliness, and shouldered its weight. That was the unspoken truth of command beneath the sea. The burden was his alone to bear, and the sea, indifferent and eternal, offered no relief. Each patrol brought with it the challenge of keeping the crew sharp despite exhaustion. The commander knew that fatigue dulled reflexes, slowed thought, and frayed tempers. In the confined steel tube, where every mistake could be fatal, this was a danger as real as any enemy ship. He rotated watches with care, ensuring that men had at least fragments of rest. He encouraged small routines, cleaning weapons, repairing uniforms, even telling stories during mealtimes to break the monotony. He himself never truly rested, but he masked his weariness behind steady eyes. His men believed he was tireless, and that belief was as valuable as torpedoes. At the core of his task was discipline. Orders had to be followed without hesitation, especially when alarms sounded and seconds decided survival. Yet discipline in such conditions was fragile. The commander enforced it not through cruelty but through presence. A calm word, a quiet glance. A reminder of duty carried more weight than shouting ever could. He understood that his authority came not only from his rank, but from the trust that he would never ask what he himself would not endure. This bond of trust was the lifeline that held the crew together. During long days submerged, the air grew stale, the humidity oppressive. Condensation dripped from the ceiling like a constant drizzle. Men grew irritable, their patience worn thin. The commander noticed these shifts immediately. He intervened with subtle changes, adjusting tasks, offering encouragement, even allowing brief moments of rest when possible. He knew that keeping spirits alive was as vital as keeping engines running. Without morale, discipline collapsed, and without discipline, survival was impossible. When the submarine finally surfaced after long stretches below, he often allowed short breaks in the conning tower. Men stood in the open air, faces lifted to the wind, eyes tracing stars they had nearly forgotten. These moments were priceless, even if brief. The commander shared them quietly, standing among his crew but never abandoning his watch. While they gazed upward, he scanned the horizon, calculating risks. He carried the burden of vigilance so they could feel, for just a heartbeat, like ordinary men again. Yet even in these fragile moments, the war never truly left him. He reminded himself that joy was temporary, that danger always lurked beyond the horizon. His role was not to share in comfort, but to ensure its continuation. Leadership beneath the sea demanded sacrifice, of rest, of freedom, of self. And so he continued, day after day, patrol after patrol, carrying the invisible weight of responsibility, knowing that his strength alone often stood between his men and the endless silence of the deep. For the commander, even routine navigation held risks that could not be ignored. Charts were never perfect, and the ocean itself shifted with currents and storms, altering conditions from one patrol to the next. He studied maps spread across his small desk, measuring distances with dividers, marking positions with careful strokes. Yet he knew the truth. At sea, precision was always uncertain. A single miscalculation could run the submarine aground or bring it too close to enemy patrol zones. The weight of these possibilities never left his mind. At night, when the stars were visible, he sometimes allowed a quick fix of their position, but even this was dangerous. The briefest exposure could reveal their location to an unseen aircraft or radar sweep. Each time he made the decision to surface, his heart carried the burden of risk, though his face showed only calm determination. Beneath the waves, he relied on instruments, trusting the compass, depth gauge, and hydrophones to guide them through the darkness. But machines could fail. A faulty needle, a damaged sensor, even a minor leak could turn confidence into catastrophe. The commander kept contingency plans ready in his head, prepared to improvise when instruments betrayed him. His mind worked endlessly, rehearsing scenarios that might never come, because in the unforgiving sea, preparedness was the only shield against disaster. Navigation was not only about reaching destinations, it was about survival. Convoys shifted routes constantly, escorted by vigilant hunters. The commander had to anticipate enemy tactics, predicting where ships might sail, where traps might be laid. This was less science than intuition, shaped by experience and sharpened by necessity. He drew upon every patrol he had ever sailed, every story he had ever heard, weaving patterns from fragments of knowledge into decisions that carried life or death. Inside the submarine, the crew often saw only the results: a change of course, a new heading, an order to dive deeper or surface earlier. They did not hear the silent debate within their commander's mind, the weighing of probabilities against risks. They trusted him without question, and he carried that trust like a heavy cloak. To them, his decisions seemed unshakable. To him, they were constant reminders of the impossible role he filled, to be both human and more than human, to navigate not only the seas but the very edge of survival. In those long hours of plotting courses and studying charts, he understood the essence of his life. It was not victory or glory that defined him, but endurance, the quiet determination to guide his men through a hostile world where every mile carried peril, and where only the steady hand of command stood between them and the silence of the deep. Moments of attack were remembered vividly by the crew, but for the commander they were measured less by excitement and more by calculation. He understood that each torpedo fired was not just a weapon but a commitment, one that might reveal their position and bring swift retribution. Before giving the order, he studied every factor: the angle of approach, the distance to target, the escort screen, even the rhythm of waves that could alter a torpedo's path. His voice remained calm, but inside his mind the tension stretched like wire. When the command finally came, "Fire 1, Fire 2, the silence of the submarine was broken by the hiss of compressed air. Then came waiting, the longest seconds in a man's life, as the torpedoes sped unseen through the dark water. For the crew, success was measured in explosions, the thunder of impact against distant hulls. They cheered when fire bloomed on the horizon, when a ship listed and sank. Yet for the commander, triumph was fleeting. He knew that escorts would react instantly, charging toward the point of origin, sonar beams sweeping, depth charges primed. He ordered evasive maneuvers before the echoes of impact even faded, driving the submarine deeper, twisting through the dark to escape. The sea soon filled with violence. Explosions pounded the water, the hull shuddered, lights flickered, and men gripped rails with white knuckles. The commander gave instructions with deliberate calm, his tone steady even when fear pressed against his chest. He knew that panic spread quickly in confined quarters, and his composure was the anchor that kept them steady. Hours might pass in this deadly dance, until at last the enemy relented or lost the trail. When quiet finally returned, exhaustion swept the crew. For them, survival felt like victory. For him, it was only a reminder of how thin the margin had been, how close they had come to joining the many U-boats already resting on the ocean floor. Later, as the crew celebrated small victories, the commander retreated into thought. He considered the wasted torpedoes that missed, the dangers they had barely escaped, the future convoys still to come. He did not allow himself to revel in destruction or despair over failure. His duty was endurance, to prepare for the next decision, the next battle, the next impossible choice. For this was the life of a U-boat commander, not one of glory, but of constant trial, where each success carried its own peril, and each day demanded more than any man should ever be asked to give. One of the cruelest realities for a U-boat commander was the lack of reliable rest. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by alarms, reports, or sudden changes in conditions. Even when he managed to close his eyes, the constant hum of engines and the creak of the hull followed him into uneasy dreams. Often he woke with the echo of depth charges still pounding in his ears, heart racing, only to realize the boat was gliding silently through calm waters. He would rise without hesitation, for there was no luxury in lingering. His men needed to believe that he never faltered. Fatigue blurred the line between reality and imagination. Shadows seemed to move in the corners of his vision. Whispers became threats, and every sound carried a weight it might not deserve. He fought against this haze with iron discipline, forcing his mind to remain clear, repeating routines that anchored him to order. He checked gauges, walked through compartments, spoke with officers, and by the act of doing so reminded himself that control was still his. Yet exhaustion was an enemy he could never fully defeat. Unlike the crew, who rotated duties, the commander's role demanded constant presence. He was the one who interpreted sonar reports, approved course changes, and gave final orders. No decision could bypass him. Even when his body begged for rest, responsibility demanded his attention. To his men, he seemed tireless, but in truth, every step carried the weight of unseen weariness. Food offered little comfort. Meals were small, often spoiled by dampness and fuel fumes, and never satisfying. Still, he joined the men in the mess, sitting shoulder to shoulder in the cramped space, sharing their rations without complaint. In these moments, he allowed himself to laugh softly at a joke, or listen to a story repeated for the 100th time. He knew that his presence among them mattered more than the food itself. It was proof that they endured together, no matter the hardship. When illness struck, the commander faced another kind of trial. There was no doctor aboard, only basic supplies and the knowledge of the men themselves. He had to decide when someone was too sick to continue duty, knowing that each lost hand meant more strain on the rest. He carried the weight of these choices quietly, never allowing frustration to show. The men saw only his calm, not the guilt he felt when someone suffered without proper care, and so fatigue, hunger, and illness became constant companions, pressing in from all sides. The commander bore them silently, for to admit their toll would be to weaken the fragile thread of morale. His life was one of endurance, not comfort, and he understood that survival depended less on strength than on the quiet ability to keep moving forward, no matter how heavy the weight became. Supplies were the hidden clock that ticked away every patrol, and the commander was always aware of it. Food, fuel, air, and even the endurance of his men were measured against time. At the start of a mission, the submarine was so crammed with provisions that there was hardly space to move. Bread and vegetables filled bunks, meat hung from hooks near machinery, and every spare corner was packed with tins. But as days stretched into weeks, the smell of rot replaced freshness. Mould crept across loaves, and potatoes sprouted in the damp air. The commander ate the same spoiled meals as his men, never asking for better, but he monitored the situation carefully. Hunger was not just physical, it eroded morale, and low morale could be fatal. Fuel was an even stricter master. Every maneuver, every sudden dive or sprint on the surface drained precious reserves. The commander calculated constantly, plotting courses that balanced safety with economy. He knew that reckless movement could leave them stranded, unable to return to base. His pencil marks on charts were not just navigation, they were lifelines, each mile carefully rationed like food itself. Oxygen was another resource, invisible but deadly in its absence. As the air grew heavy, headaches and dizziness spread through the boat. The commander checked the gauges with grim attention, deciding when to risk surfacing for fresh air. The decision was never simple. The enemy above hunted constantly, and surfacing could invite sudden death. Yet to stay below too long meant slow suffocation. It was always a choice between two forms of danger, and the responsibility of that choice weighed solely on him. Even the endurance of men was something he measured. He watched their faces, noted who struggled to stay awake, who lost patience, who showed signs of despair. These were supplies too, though not written on paper. He spent words carefully, offering encouragement when needed, discipline when required. He understood that human strength, once exhausted, could not be replaced like fuel or food. And so the commander's mind became a ledger, balancing visible and invisible resources alike. He rationed not only bread and diesel, but also hope, confidence, and calm. His voice was the final reserve, and he used it sparingly, knowing that one word could steady a man as surely as any meal. This constant calculation, unseen by the crew, was part of what made his life nearly impossible. The submarine moved forward, but with each mile the clock ticked louder, and it was his task alone to ensure that they reached the end before the end reached them. Every commander knew that danger did not always come from enemy ships or the sea itself. Sometimes it came from within the submarine. Mechanical failure was a constant threat. The engines, run for endless hours, could overheat or seize. Pumps that kept seawater at bay could falter, flooding compartments before repairs could be made. Batteries, essential for submerged travel, emitted dangerous gases and sometimes sparked fires. The commander walked the length of his vessel daily, inspecting, questioning, listening. He relied on his chief engineer, but ultimate responsibility remained his. If something failed, it was not the machine that would be blamed. It was him. The smell of oil and fuel lingered everywhere, a reminder of how fragile the boat truly was. Even the smallest leak of seawater through a valve carried menace, for pressure at depth could widen cracks into fatal breaches. The commander trained himself to notice details others overlooked. the uneven throb of an engine, the faint hiss of air, the sudden tilt of a gauge. His survival depended on anticipation. Repairs at sea were rough, often improvised with limited tools, and he admired the ingenuity of his men. Yet he knew that ingenuity was no substitute for security. Each patch was temporary, each fix only a reprieve. He never allowed the crew to see his unease, but in his heart he carried the fear that the boat might betray them from within. Fires were his greatest nightmare. Smoke spread instantly in the confined space, and flames devoured oxygen needed for life. He drilled the crew constantly, preparing them to act without hesitation. When alarms rang, his voice cut through chaos with calm orders, guiding men who trusted him to see them through. Even so, he knew that one uncontrollable blaze could end everything faster than an enemy attack. The psychological strain of this knowledge was immense. On land, a commander might blame fate or superior orders when disaster struck. On a U-boat, there was no one else, only him. Every malfunction, every mishap became a personal burden. To keep morale alive, he praised successes loudly and addressed failures quietly, never allowing the fragile fabric of confidence to tear. His men saw a commander who seemed unshaken, who always had a plan, who treated danger as routine. They did not see the silent prayers he whispered in his mind each time the engines roared back to life after faltering, or the relief he buried when a leak was sealed. In the end, his calm in the face of failure was not only leadership, it was survival, for fear could spread faster than fire, and only his steadiness kept it contained. Isolation was perhaps the most relentless enemy of all. For the commander, weeks at sea stretched into a blur where one day was indistinguishable from the next. He could not allow himself to admit how deeply the monotony ate at him, because his men looked to him for strength. Yet in truth, the endless cycle of watches, inspections and reports wore him down like water against stone. The submarine became a world unto itself, sealed away from light, air and the rhythms of nature. The commander alone bore the task of holding that world together. To combat the crushing sameness, he clung to routine. Logbooks were filled with precise entries, navigation charts updated with almost obsessive care, even when there was little to record. These tasks gave structure where time dissolved. He enforced rituals among the crew, mealtimes kept regular, duties rotated, inspections conducted with care. To outsiders they might have seemed trivial, but within the steel tube they were lifelines, threads that tied men to sanity. He himself relied on them just as much as his sailors, though he never confessed it. Letters from home, received before departure, were another anchor. The commander carried a few, folded and refolded until the creases threatened to tear the paper. In rare moments alone, he opened them, tracing the handwriting as if it could bridge the distance between his life above and the prison below. Yet he quickly locked such memories away, for dwelling on them too long risked weakening the armour of duty he wore so carefully. Loneliness was sharper for him than for the crew. They had one another, shared stories, played games when time allowed. He had only himself. He could not confess doubt to his officers or reveal weariness to his sailors. His solitude was complete, even in the crowded submarine. That was the paradox of command, surrounded always, yet utterly alone. The isolation sometimes made his thoughts drift in dangerous directions. He found himself wondering about the war beyond his small vessel, decisions made by distant leaders, battles fought on land, victories and defeats that might already render his efforts meaningless. But he forced those thoughts away, reminding himself that his world was here, within these walls, with these men. His duty was immediate, not abstract. He could not afford the luxury of broader reflection when survival was measured in hours, and so he endured the isolation by burying it, showing only calm to his crew. His loneliness was a secret companion, carried silently through each patrol, a weight he bore so that his men might never feel its full force. This sacrifice, invisible yet constant, was one more reason why life as a U-boat commander was almost impossible. Every commander understood that the ocean itself was a classroom, and each patrol brought lessons written not in books but in survival. He learned to read the subtle language of waves, the tone of the engines, the rhythm of silence. A sudden stillness in the water might signal danger as surely as a distant explosion. These instincts, sharpened by endless repetition, became his greatest tools. Yet the lessons were never gentle. They were paid for with sleepless nights and heavy burdens. To his men, his decisions appeared effortless, but in truth they were forged from countless hours of observation and worry. Training had prepared him for procedures, but not for the crushing responsibility of applying them when lives hung in the balance. What no manual had taught was how to carry the weight of uncertainty. Charts could show positions, hydrophones could report bearings, but the sea was always shifting, hiding truth beneath layers of deception. The commander often felt as though he were blind, guided only by echoes and instinct. To his crew, he projected certainty. Inside, he fought the constant whisper of doubt. He could never confess that, for doubt in him would become doubt in all. The crew's belief was fragile but essential, and he nurtured it like flame in the wind. Discipline was another lesson, not just for the sailors but for him as well. He learned to control his voice, his expression, even his smallest gestures. In moments of crisis, men studied him as closely as they studied gauges, drawing strength from the steadiness of his tone or the calmness of his stance. He discovered that leadership was as much about performance as it was about command. To falter outwardly, even for a second, risked shattering the delicate balance that kept fear contained. So he wore composure like armour, even when his heart raced. Patience was perhaps the hardest lesson. Hours of silence, days without action, weeks of endless routine tested endurance more than combat. The commander learned to wait, to let opportunity come rather than forcing it. He taught himself to breathe slowly, to think deeply, to make peace with stillness. In that stillness lay survival, though it pressed upon the mind with suffocating weight. The men endured it because he did, and so he bore the burden quietly, giving them no glimpse of how it gnawed at him. In the end, the commander understood that his life was defined by lessons with no rest, no reprieve. Every decision, every gesture, every word carried meaning. His men might remember him as calm, steady and unshaken, but he knew the truth, that leadership beneath the sea was less about strength than about the endless endurance of carrying fear, doubt and responsibility in silence. The commander's world was measured in sound. In the deep, vision was useless, and survival depended on listening. The hydrophone became his ears, translating the vast silence into patterns of noise. He spent hours beside the operator, leaning close, asking for bearings, distances, changes in rhythm. A faint hum could be a convoy of merchant ships. A sharp, quick beat might be a destroyer on patrol, and a sudden burst of static could mean sonar pulses sweeping the sea in search of them. He built an invisible map in his mind from these fragments, piecing together the world above with only echoes for guidance. His patience was endless. He listened for hours, waiting for the right moment to act. To his men, this seemed like intuition, but in truth it was the discipline of hearing every detail, remembering every sound, and never dismissing even the faintest trace. Silence, however, was not always comfort. Sometimes the hydrophones gave nothing, no sign of ships or aircraft. That emptiness was not safety. It was uncertainty. Was the enemy gone, or were they lying in wait? Was the sea truly empty, or did danger lurk just beyond the edge of hearing? The commander bore this uncertainty alone, never allowing it to spread among his crew. He taught them to accept silence as part of their existence, but inside he wrestled with the endless questions it carried. During attacks, sound became chaos. Torpedoes launched with a hiss. Seconds later, explosions thundered through the hull, and then came the furious pounding of depth charges. The submarine shook with each detonation, pipes rattled, lights flickered, and men gritted their teeth in the darkness. Through it all, the commander listened, not only with his ears but with his entire being. He measured the distance of explosions, guessed the patterns of enemy sweeps, and timed evasive maneuvers with deadly precision. His calm commands cut through fear, steadying men who clung to the hope that he could hear what they could not. Yet the sea itself had its own voice. The groan of the hull under pressure, the rush of currents, the drip of condensation, these sounds never stopped. At times they blended with imagination, making even seasoned commanders question what was real. The line between noise and meaning blurred, and he had to trust not only instruments but his own instinct. That instinct, honed by years of repetition, became his most valuable weapon. In the rare moments when the submarine surfaced under a calm night sky, the contrast was overwhelming. After weeks of muffled echoes and mechanical hums, the open silence of the ocean felt almost alien. The commander stood in the conning tower, listening to waves lap gently against the hull, to the wind sweeping across the water. It was a reminder that the world outside the war still existed, vast and different. Yet even then, his ears strained for danger, for the faint drone of an aircraft or the far-off throb of engines. For him, sound was never truly absent. It was the constant thread that bound his existence, the key to survival, and the reminder of how fragile their lives were beneath the sea. One of the most impossible burdens for a U-boat commander was the constant need to appear unshakable. His men looked to him for strength in every moment, and so he became a symbol of certainty, even when inside he wrestled with fear and exhaustion. Leadership beneath the sea was not simply about giving orders. It was about embodying calm in an environment designed to break the human spirit. Every gesture, every word, every pause carried weight, for the crew read their commander as carefully as they read the gauges on the control panels. A raised eyebrow could spark unease, a wavering tone could spread doubt, and so he mastered the art of composure, keeping his voice level, his face steady, his movements deliberate. This performance was not deception, but survival. He knew that in the tight confines of the submarine, fear was contagious, and if it spread unchecked, it could undo them faster than any enemy weapon. His men, crowded together in darkness, carried their own private terrors, and they needed to believe that their commander was immune. He was not. He felt the same pounding heart when depth charges rumbled nearby, the same fatigue after sleepless nights, the same hunger when food spoiled. But unlike the crew, he could not share these feelings. His solitude was absolute. He bore them in silence, carrying their weight as if it were part of his uniform. At times the mask of composure grew heavy. Alone in his small cabin, bent over charts, he allowed his face to soften, his shoulders to slump. These were his only private moments of honesty, fleeting and fragile. But the instant he stepped back into the control room, the mask returned, and the men saw only steadiness. It was an endless performance, but one he knew was essential. The commander also understood the power of small gestures. A calm hand on a sailor's shoulder, a steady word of praise, a quiet acknowledgement of effort. These acts cost him little, but gave his men strength. He knew how to ration not only food and fuel, but also reassurance, offering it at just the right time, never too much, never too little. His presence itself became a kind of oxygen, keeping morale alive when the air grew thin. Yet the paradox remained. The stronger he appeared, the lonelier he became. No one asked him how he endured, for they assumed he needed nothing. His strength isolated him, even as it sustained the crew. This was the true impossibility of his role, not the sea, not the enemy, but the demand to be both human and more than human, to carry silently what no man should have to carry, and to do it every day without faltering. In that way, the commander was as much prisoner as leader, bound by the mask he wore, trapped by the very strength that kept his men alive. The sea offered no comfort, only choices between dangers. For the commander, every decision meant trading one risk for another. To surface in daylight invited the eyes of aircraft. To remain submerged too long starved the crew of oxygen. To press an attack promised glory but invited swift retaliation. To retreat preserved lives but might waste a rare opportunity. Each path carried peril, and the commander bore the weight of choosing. He understood that survival was not about avoiding risk, but about enduring it wisely. His logbook was filled with notations that seemed simple on paper. Course changes, speed adjustments, depth readings. Yet behind every line was a storm of thought, calculations made in silence while men waited for his orders. They saw only his decision, not the sleepless debate that preceded it. Sometimes the burden was unbearable, but he carried it because no one else could. He lived on the edge of uncertainty, balancing instinct against information, knowing that even the best judgment could still lead to disaster. When he ordered an attack, he knew that victory and destruction were equally possible. When he chose restraint, he felt the weight of unseen critics, far away in headquarters, who demanded results without ever knowing the reality of life beneath the sea. He accepted their judgments, but never let them weaken his resolve. His duty was not to please distant commanders, but to bring his men home alive. There were times when doubt clawed at him in the quiet hours. Had he chosen correctly? Had his caution saved lives or wasted chances? These questions haunted him, but he could never voice them. To his men, he was certainty itself, the anchor in the shifting tides. He learned to silence his doubts, to bury them deep where no one could see. This suppression was its own battle, one that wore on him just as much as fatigue or hunger. Leadership demanded that he sacrifice not only comfort but truth, the truth of his humanity, his fear, his uncertainty. In rare moments of solitude, he allowed himself to feel it, staring at the dim lamplight flickering against steel walls. But when he emerged, the mask was back in place, and the crew saw only a commander who seemed unshaken. That was the paradox of his life. He was forced to be more than a man while knowing he was only human. And yet he endured, because endurance itself was the essence of command. Every impossible choice, every hidden doubt, every sacrifice of self was part of the duty he had accepted. It was this duty, relentless and merciless, that defined why life as a U-boat commander was almost impossible. The commander's thoughts often drifted to the unseen war above. He imagined the convoys stretching across the ocean, ships filled with supplies guarded by destroyers that prowled with deadly patience. He knew that each patrol was part of a larger struggle, yet his world was so small. Steel walls, dim lights, the breathing of men packed tightly together. The contrast was sharp. The war was vast, but his battlefield was confined to a single vessel, a fragile bubble of survival in an ocean that cared nothing for human ambition. He accepted this paradox, though it pressed on him every day. News from the outside came rarely, through coded radio messages or whispered rumours passed from one patrol base to another. He sometimes wondered what victories or defeats had already unfolded without his knowledge, what changes in the war might render his efforts meaningless. But he forced such thoughts away. His world was here, in the present, with his men. He could not afford to carry the weight of the entire conflict when even guiding his boat safely through the night demanded everything he had. Still, he felt the pull of history. He knew that one mistake might erase them forever, while one success might ripple outward, unseen but vital. This awareness gave him a strange kind of solace. Even in isolation, even in silence, his choices mattered. For his men, the submarine was a prison, but for him, it was also a stage where every action echoed far beyond what they could see. In these reflections, he sometimes found a quiet strength. He thought of his role not only as survival, but as service, a thread woven into a larger tapestry of sacrifice. That perspective allowed him to endure when despair threatened. He was not only leading men through darkness, he was contributing in his own way to a cause greater than himself. Yet he also knew the cruel truth. History might never remember them. Many U-boats vanished without record, their crews buried in silence at the bottom of the sea. Their names were lost, their efforts unseen. The commander lived with that knowledge every day, understanding that glory was not guaranteed, that even survival was uncertain. He accepted anonymity as part of his duty. What mattered was the trust of his men, the knowledge that they looked to him for guidance, and that he gave it without hesitation. That was his true legacy. Not medals, not recognition, but the endurance of human lives against impossible odds. In that knowledge, he found the strength to continue, even when the sea and the war seemed endless. Night patrols were some of the most testing moments for a U-boat commander. Under the cover of darkness, the submarine could surface to recharge batteries, take in fresh air, and travel at greater speed. But the night was not safety. It was only a different kind of danger. The commander climbed into the conning tower, the cold wind cutting against his face, and scanned the horizon with sharp eyes. Stars glittered above, their beauty stark against the black water, but he had no time to admire them. Each star could reveal their silhouette to enemy eyes. Each ripple of moonlight could betray their wake. The ocean at night was vast and quiet, but within that quiet lurked hunters. The commander listened for the faint drone of aircraft engines, or the distant throb of destroyers. He knew that detection at night could be just as deadly as during the day, for searchlights and flares could turn darkness into a trap within seconds. His duty was to balance the desperate need for air and speed with the risk of being caught in the open. He ordered lookouts posted, their eyes straining in the dim light, while his own gaze never rested. The night wind carried a sharp loneliness, reminding him of how far from the world they had drifted. He thought of towns sleeping peacefully under the same stars, of families unaware of the battles unfolding far away. For a moment, he allowed himself to feel that distance, but then he pushed it aside. His men needed him in the present, not lost in memory. Below, the crew felt the difference when the hatches opened. Fresh air swept through the boat, lifting spirits, clearing lungs choked by days of stale atmosphere. Some men whispered that they could almost smell home in the wind. The commander heard these murmurs and let them speak, for he knew such moments of hope were precious. Yet even then, he reminded himself that the ocean gave nothing freely. Every breath of fresh air carried the shadow of danger. Navigation at night was a delicate art. The commander studied the stars, aligning them with charts, correcting course with precision. He knew that one mistake in calculation could carry them into enemy patrols or dangerous waters. He trusted the heavens as guides, but even they could deceive, clouded by sudden weather or shifting seas. And so he relied on instinct as much as instruments, making choices in silence while his men trusted him blindly. The night gave them speed, air, and a fleeting sense of freedom, but it gave him only more responsibility. When dawn threatened, he made the call to dive again, sealing the crew back into darkness. For them, the memory of night air was enough to endure another day below. For him, it was another reminder that every gift the sea offered came with a hidden cost, and it was his task alone to decide when to pay it. The commander often reflected on the fragile thread that bound his crew together. In the confined world of the U-boat, every man's action affected the survival of all. A careless word, a missed duty, a failure of courage could ripple through the boat like a crack in steel. It was his task to prevent that crack from forming. He watched his men closely, not only for skill, but for spirit. He learned their strengths, the steady patience of one, the sharp hearing of another, the quiet resilience of a third. He placed them carefully where they could serve best, like pieces on a chessboard, knowing that each move might one day decide life or death. Trust was his most valuable weapon. He trusted his men to follow orders without hesitation, and they trusted him to lead them wisely. This mutual faith was not automatic. It was built through countless small moments, sharing their meals, enduring the same damp and hunger, speaking with respect even in command. These acts created a bond stronger than steel. Yet the commander also understood how fragile it was. A single failure of leadership could shatter it beyond repair. He carried that knowledge every day, ensuring that his decisions upheld their confidence. Discipline remained the foundation. Drills were repeated until movements became instinct, so that in crisis there would be no hesitation. Men sometimes grumbled at the repetition, but the commander knew its value. He had seen fear turn hands clumsy, voices falter, thoughts freeze. Only habit and discipline could guide them through such moments, and so he demanded precision, not from cruelty but from necessity. Camaraderie flourished in strange ways. Jokes whispered in the mess, songs hummed softly in the dark, stories told and retold. These became lifelines. The commander did not discourage them, though he rarely joined. His role was different. He was the steady centre, the one who carried solitude so that others might share laughter. He allowed their humanity to thrive, even as he buried his own. In this balance lay the true impossibility of his life, to be part of the crew, yet apart from it. He was their leader, their anchor, but never their equal. They trusted him completely, but he could not lean on them in return. His trust had to remain silent, unspoken, carried in the decisions he made and the burdens he bore. This invisible distance was the price of command, and yet, when he looked into the tired faces of his men, he knew it was a price worth paying. For in their endurance, in their faith, he found the strength to continue, guiding them through the endless night of the sea. The end of a patrol was often the most difficult time for a U-boat commander. Returning to port meant survival, yet it did not bring peace. As the submarine approached familiar waters, the commander remained tense, for he knew the enemy sometimes lurked even near home. Mines floated unseen, patrols prowled, and one mistake so close to safety could erase weeks of endurance. Only when the boat finally entered harbour, when the mooring lines were secured and the engines silenced, could he allow himself the smallest breath of relief. The crew cheered, some wept quietly, others stared in silence at the land they thought they might never see again. For them, the patrol was over. For him, it was only a pause before the next. On shore, reports had to be written, debriefings endured, orders received. Headquarters judged success not by survival but by numbers, ships sunk, tonnage destroyed. The commander submitted his records with steady professionalism, but inside he felt the weight of what was left unsaid. The near misses, the sleepless nights, the invisible burdens carried in silence. No report could capture the human cost of command. Families sometimes greeted the crew, but the commander often stood apart, shaking hands, offering nods, his emotions hidden behind the mask he had worn for weeks. He was proud of his men, proud that he had brought them back, but he knew not all commanders were so fortunate. Many boats had not returned, their names crossed off lists with quiet finality. He thought of them as he walked the docks, ghosts that would never step ashore again. The burden of survival was its own weight, to live when others had not brought guilt as well as relief. The commander rarely spoke of it, but he carried it with him always. Between patrols he allowed himself moments of ordinary life, walking streets, hearing birds, tasting fresh food. But these moments felt unreal, like dreams soon to be shattered. He knew he would return to the sea, to the silence, to the impossible choices. His life was bound to the U-boat, and the war demanded nothing less. For his men, each return meant hope renewed. For him, it was another reminder of the endless cycle of endurance. The sea still waited, the enemy still hunted, and duty still called. He would answer because he had no choice. That was the truth of his existence. a commander not defined by victories or failures, but by the strength to bear what no one else could. And so his life remained what it had always been, lonely, relentless, and almost impossible. A story lived in silence beneath the waves, remembered only by those who trusted him with their lives in the darkest depths of war.